He didn't plan for the storm. No man does. Zeno of Citium was just another merchant, living the life handed to him, until the sea decided otherwise. One shipwreck and everything he built was gone. Gold, goods, future plans, reputation, all of it swallowed by the ocean. And yet he didn't curse the waves. He called it the beginning of his life. That's not how we usually see loss. We call it unfair. We fight it. We numb it. But Zeno stood at the shore with nothing, and somehow that silence became his foundation. He didn't rebuild the same life. He built a new one not centered around comfort or gain, but around character. The truth is, most men don't fear destruction. They fear what comes after. The empty space, the silence, the question, now what? Because in the chase for pleasure, for comfort, for approval, we build false scaffolding, and when it collapses, we confuse emptiness with failure. But what if that silence is sacred? Pleasure for Zeno wasn't just a worldly indulgence. It was a mask, a way to stay afloat in a world that rewards distraction. But when the storm stripped him bare, he saw what had always been underneath, chaos pretending to be clarity. He thought he was aligned, but he was addicted to the illusion of control, the anesthesia of routine, the lie that comfort equals peace. That illusion is ancient, and it lives in you too. You chase comfort, but it leaves you restless. You chase validation, but it makes you smaller. You chase stimulation, scrolling, consuming, proving, pleasing, until you can't hear your own voice anymore, until even your pleasure feels hollow, until silence terrifies you more than pain. But then something breaks, a relationship, a dream, a version of yourself, and in the silence that follows, there's panic, not peace, because you weren't chasing pleasure, you were escaping, and now, there's nowhere left to run. That's when the real journey begins, not by adding more noise, but by removing the lies, not by healing what she broke, but by facing what you forgot. The fog doesn't lift because you fought harder. It lifts because you finally stopped pretending. Epictetus said it simply, freedom is not achieved by satisfying desire, but by eliminating it. You won't find yourself at the end of the chase. You'll find yourself when you stop running, when you stop pleasing, when you stop needing. That's the fire Zeno walked through. And you will too, not to burn, but to be refined, not to be saved, but to see clearly. This isn't about punishment. It's about purification. And once the chase ends, what remains is you, not the version built for her approval, not the man who lived on reaction, but the one who learns to stand, silently, inside his own skin. Now the question is, what begins when you finally stop chasing pleasure? Let's begin. When a man finally stops chasing pleasure, the first thing he feels isn't peace. It's panic, not loud, not violent, but quiet and crawling, like waking up in a house that no longer feels like home. The absence of noise, of stimulation, of reward, doesn't bring calm. It brings withdrawal, not from a substance, but from a story. You told yourself the distractions were small, that the scrolling was just a break, that the constant checking, the texting, the need for attention was normal. You thought you were managing stress, you were managing emptiness. Every dopamine hit wasn't pleasure, it was anesthesia. The pain was never gone, it was just sedated, and now without it, it starts speaking. It's subtle at first, a restless night, a lingering fatigue, the way your hands don't know where to go when the screen goes black. Then it deepens. The silence after stimulation becomes unbearable. Your mind turns against itself, replaying regrets, questions, unmet needs. That's not weakness. That's detox. Emotional, spiritual, ancient. Science calls it a collapse in your reward system. But this isn't about science. This is about memory, about all the moments you ignored because pleasure made them easier to forget. Now they rise like ghosts, and you're left sitting in your own presence for the first time in years, with nothing to numb you but your breath. This is the part no one talks about. The part after you stop, the empty hallway where your distractions used to live, and in that hallway you hear something else, a voice you thought was gone, yours, not the one that performs, the one that remembers. The soul doesn't shout, it waits, and when your pleasure dies, your soul starts speaking again. At first, it's just a whisper, a question, a scar you never looked at. But if you stay with it, if you don't run, that silence becomes strength. The panic becomes passage. You weren't addicted to the pleasure. You were addicted to forgetting. Now it's time to remember. This is where rebuilding begins. Not through more, but through less. Through the space you once feared. Through the quiet that used to haunt you. Through the part of you that finally stopped escaping. There's a moment most men never see coming. It doesn't arrive with thunder or warning. It slips in during silence. And when it hits, it cuts deep. The realization that you've been building your identity from the outside in. That your worth, your sense of self, was never truly yours. It was borrowed, leased, reflected. She smiled, and you felt seen. Your son laughed, and you felt important. The deal closed, the text came, the room laughed, and for a second, you existed. But when the noise stops, when she leaves, when the applause fades, when the room goes quiet, you look around and realize you don't know who you are without them. That's not vanity, that's conditioning. You were taught, not through words but through silence, that a man's value comes from what he provides, what he produces, who he pleases. Your hands had to move, your voice had to be useful, your presence had to serve. And somewhere in that utility, your essence disappeared. You weren't addicted to pleasure, you were addicted to mirrors, because mirrors gave you something the world withheld. Confirmation that you mattered, that you were enough, that someone saw you. But mirrors break, and when they do, all that remains is a man staring at his own reflection, wondering if there's anything behind it. That's the quiet collapse of an outsourced identity. Not dramatic, not loud, just the hollow sound of a man trying to find his own echo. And it's in that space, raw and unfamiliar, that the real work begins. Not the kind of work that impresses anyone, the kind that requires silence, solitude, and brutal honesty. You begin to rebuild, not based on roles or responses, but on values. You move slower, you speak less, you stop reaching for applause, because now you're not asking, will she approve? You're asking, does this align with who I'm becoming? This is the shift from function to form, from mirror to foundation, from reaction to presence. It doesn't make you louder, it makes you clearer. And clarity, for a man who used to beg for reflection, becomes the most dangerous peace he's ever known. Stillness should feel like rest, but for many men, it feels like danger, like something's wrong, like they're failing. Because stillness was never safety, it was punishment. As a boy, you sat quietly in the silence of disapproval. As a young man, you stayed silent to avoid conflict. As an adult, you moved, achieved, performed, because the only time you were noticed was when you were useful. So when you finally stop chasing pleasure, when the noise fades and the movement ends, you don't feel peace, you feel exposed. The absence of action feels like abandonment, not because it is, but because somewhere deep you were taught. Stillness means you've been forgotten. That's the trauma most men carry. Love had terms, presence had price tags. You weren't taught to exist, you were taught to earn, smile for attention, speak only to please, work to be seen. So you ran, not to win, but to be visible, to feel loved, even if it was conditional. And now you've stopped. The chase is over, and the quiet that follows doesn't feel like healing. It feels like failure, like regression. Because no one ever told you that stillness is strength. No one ever showed you that a man who doesn't move can still be present, that a man who doesn't speak can still command respect, that a man who sits in his own silence is not weak. He's dangerous. But here you are, alone with echoes. Echoes of all the love that never landed, all the approval you tried to buy, all the worth you tried to prove. And in that silence, something ancient starts to rise. Not anger, not ambition, but awareness of who you were, of who you are without performance. Stillness is where the noise dies and the truth begins. Stillness is where your power starts to gather again, not in fists, but in presence, in breath, in restraint. The traumatized man thinks he must act to survive, but the healed man knows sometimes survival looks like stillness, and stillness, for the man who once equated motion with meaning, becomes the most rebellious thing he'll ever learn to trust. At first it feels like loss, like the world is ignoring you, like the current has moved on and you've been left standing still. You used to ask yourself, what will they think, before every decision. You calculated, adjusted, softened your words, your truth, your presence, just to keep the peace, to be accepted, to not be alone. But something changes when you stop chasing pleasure. You stop asking for permission. It's not rebellion, it's realignment, because pleasure was never neutral. It was bait, and behind every pursuit was a quiet voice. Am I enough yet? But when you strip all of that away, the image, the performance, the pleasing, you're left with the man who was always waiting in the background, the one who doesn't ask to be liked, the one who no longer explains himself. There's a shift that happens in that silence, slowly, like dust settling after a storm. You begin to feel what's yours and what never was. You start asking different questions, not to others, but to yourself. Not will she stay, or will they approve, but does this feel right? And does this reflect the man I'm becoming? And the answers don't always come quickly, but they come clean. They come without noise. You notice you're no longer reacting to everything. You don't have the same need to explain your choices. You don't rush, you wait, you watch, you move with intent. This is internal authority, not the kind that demands or boasts, but the kind that moves silently because it doesn't need confirmation. It doesn't wait for applause. It doesn't panic in disapproval. It knows. And when a man returns to that kind of knowing, he becomes untouchable, not because he wins every battle, but because he no longer fights the wrong ones, because now his compass is internal, and that compass doesn't point toward comfort. It points toward alignment, and alignment, earned in silence, forged in solitude, becomes the only validation that matters. Something strange happens when you stop needing to be seen. You become visible in a different way, not louder, not flashier, just present, rooted, unmoved, and people feel it, even if they can't name it. You don't chase the room anymore, but somehow the room shifts when you enter, not because you take up space, but because you don't. Pleasure once kept you tethered to the surface, always reaching, always proving, always filling silence with performance. But now, there's nothing left to chase. And without that hunger, you radiate something deeper, absence of need. And that absence unsettles people who survive on distraction. They don't know why they pull away, why the jokes fall flat, why the conversations shift. But deep down, they sense it. You're not here to impress. You're not playing the game. You're not looking for approval. You've seen what's behind the mask, and you're no longer interested in wearing one. This is when you start to lose popularity, not because you changed, but because you stopped pretending. The superficial doesn't know what to do with stillness. It doesn't know how to hold eye contact with someone who doesn't flinch. It doesn't know how to respond to a man who listens more than he speaks, and speaks only when it matters. But in losing noise, you gain influence. In losing applause, you gain gravity. People might not say it, but they feel it. Your restraint, your calm, your quiet refusal to be pulled into their chaos. You become a mirror, not of their expectations, but of their absence. And not everyone can handle that reflection. This is applied Stoicism, not as theory, but as presence. You stop performing, you start being, and in a world full of spectacle, being becomes radical. Being becomes power, and power, when it's no longer desperate to be seen, becomes unshakable. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic moment where the mask falls off and the real you steps forward. It's slower than that, quieter, like shedding skin you didn't know you were wearing. And with every layer that peels away, something inside aches. Not from injury, but from memory. The man you used to be wasn't fake. He was necessary. He smiled when he didn't feel like it. He said yes when he wanted to say nothing. He proved, performed, chased, because he thought that's what love required. And maybe for a time it did. Maybe that mask helped you survive. But now, it's suffocating. When you stop chasing pleasure, you stop feeding that false self. The persona, the version of you shaped by fear of abandonment, hunger for recognition, and quiet desperation for peace. At first it feels like freedom, but quickly it turns to grief. Because letting go of him means letting go of who you thought you had to be. And grief is never just about loss. It's about what you gave up to hold on to something that never really held you back. It's about the years you spent bending, adjusting, becoming small. It's about the moments you silenced yourself just to feel close to someone who never really saw you. That false self was a shield, and now that it's dying, the wounds underneath begin to breathe. You feel exposed, raw, maybe even ashamed. But that pain isn't weakness. It's a kind of birth. Masculine rebirth doesn't arrive with celebration. It arrives with stillness, with surrender, with the echo of who you used to be, fading. And yet, there's dignity in that death, because for the first time, you're not becoming someone. You're unbecoming what the world demanded. And what's left, the man beneath the mask, may be quieter. But he's real. He's scarred. He's whole. At some point, the noise fades. The cravings quiet down. The need to impress, to chase, to be validated, loses its grip. And in the space left behind, something unfamiliar begins to grow. Not excitement, not drama, just rhythm, just presence, just life without the ache to run from it. This is where redemption begins. Not with fireworks, but with still mornings, with unhurried meals, with eye contact that doesn't seek approval. You start doing things not to feel better, but to feel whole. You walk, not to escape, but to return. You sit, not out of exhaustion, but because there's nowhere else you need to be. Pleasure stops being the goal. Meaning replaces it. The empty hours you once filled with scrolling, noise, or numbing become sacred. You begin choosing silence over stimulation, depth over distraction, solitude over noise, not because you've turned bitter, but because you've finally turned inward. You build slower now. You speak less. You notice more. Conversations deepen. The quality of your hours shifts. What once felt like a prison, routine, discipline, stillness, becomes your sanctuary. Your life becomes a monastery. Not of walls, but of intention. Not of retreat, but of sovereignty. And in this quiet rebuilding, you realize something rare. You no longer need to escape the life you're living. You've stopped running. Not because everything is perfect, but because now it's real. Because now it's yours. Zeno understood something most men never do. Destruction isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the only path to clarity. When his ship sank, he didn't just lose possessions. He lost illusion. He lost the comfort that kept him from becoming. And in that emptiness, something ancient was revealed. The fire doesn't just burn, it refines. He called it the beginning of his life, not because it felt good, but because it forced him to look inward. It stripped away the masks, the comfort, the false peace. What remained was not a weaker man, but a clearer one. And clarity, earned through fire, doesn't ask for validation. It simply knows. The Stoics saw fire not as punishment, but as purification. Pleasure, when misused, is that fire turned inward. It burns your roots. It distracts you from pain while quietly eroding your foundation. But when you stop feeding it, when you let the illusions fall away, you're left with something colder, cleaner, truer. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What stands in the way becomes the way." And that's the paradox of masculine discipline. You're not healed by avoiding pain. You're healed by standing in it, without flinching, without begging, without blaming. That's where strength is born. In silence, in restraint, in the refusal to be consumed. Your silence becomes armor. Your discipline becomes the gate. Your stillness becomes proof, not of defeat, but of sovereignty. And one day, without fanfare, you look around and realize the chase is over. You're no longer running after approval, after pleasure, after her. You're walking toward yourself, and that walk, slow and grounded, is the return, not to who you were, but to who you always were beneath the noise. Beneath the fear, beneath the fire. When the chase ends, the man begins.